amazing time last year. I'm so glad to be back working with all you. It's really been incredible so far. So I started teaching at IU just last year. I just finished my second year, and toward the end of my first year, I started in my studio with a Steinway B, a 7-foot, and then a Steinway L. And the Steinway B was in the primo position, and the Steinway L was in the second position. And so just at the end of the school year, I just casually wrote to the dean and to the head piano technician, and I said, if you guys are ever buying new pianos or you're shifting some pianos around, I would love to have a D in my studio at some point. Not a big deal, but just lock it away and just keep it in mind, because I would love to have a full concert grand in my studio at some point. So fast forward just a couple months, in June of last year, so June 2023, I got an email from the head piano technician, and he said, you know, Mr. Pressler has passed away, and we are moving his pianos out of his studio. Would you like one of his pianos? I said, oh my gosh, of course. So he said, well, he has the piano that's relatively new, and then an older one that needs a lot of work. So you probably want the newer one, right? And I said, absolutely not. I want the older one, of course. That's the one that all of these people, like Angela Chang and Alvin Chow, and all these people had their lessons on over the whole time Pressler was teaching at IU. So I want that old piano. And I happen to, I'm sure all of you have had the opportunity to play nicely rebuilt old Steinways. It's just a really magnificent, wonderful, wonderful sound. So overwhelmingly, I got Mr. Pressler's piano in my studio. So I have his 1945 Steinway D in my studio. It is really terrific. It does indeed need a lot of work. It's getting new hammers actually this July, which is going to be really life-changing for it. So I'm going to talk about just having Mr. Pressler's piano in my studio and kind of channeling his energy through that. But really how this lecture came about is, Ms. Penny's asked me to do one of the soirees, and I said I would absolutely love to do a soiree, but I can only play the Debussy preludes. That is what I'm playing right now. I have no other time to practice anything else. So she said, well, you just got Pressler's piano, so why don't you talk about channeling his energy, and you know, he loved sound, and he did love Debussy, so then you can play some Debussy preludes. So they're not, the two subjects aren't completely related, but I wrote to a bunch of his former students, including some people you guys have worked with in the last couple weeks, and I got some great stories and memories of that piano, and also of Mr. Pressler that I'll read to you as well. So I really have no direct connection to Menahem Pressler, but I studied my last year of high school with one of his former assistants from the 1970s. His name is Robert Myer, and he teaches at Baldwin Wallace College in Ohio. So he was my teacher my last year of high school, and so I feel I got a bit of Pressler's essence through just what he gave me. He talked a lot about involving my entire mechanism and making sound and choreographing movements and technique, and I know he got a lot of that from Mr. Pressler. And I think my only real direct connection before that to Pressler was having watched him on the documentary of the Van Cliburn competition of 1993, which came out when I was in high school, and at that time I think I had it memorized word for word. I could just recite the entire thing. I watched it so many times. And Mr. Pressler had a couple great quotes from that, which I took the opportunity to look up. First quote, which I always remember, is he said, I love music, and I would love to meet another lover. I don't want to meet another player. I thought that was so good. And then another great quote he said is, he said once, this was before we knew to use he or she, but so he kept saying he. But anyway, he said, once he reaches me, I assume he will reach an audience. And it is interesting too that you hear immediately when someone plays with a sympathy for the composer or love for the composer, that his whole playing takes on a different dimension or a different feeling, that his hands touch the keyboard and the keyboard responds. And I think that's so good. I think hopefully we are all trying to bring ourselves to what we do, but also tap into the composer's essence and really channel the composer and what they intended through what we play. You know, I feel being at IU, it's really overwhelming being at IU. It's just such a historic school, and I still can't quite believe I'm there. And I do, in a way, I feel I was born in the wrong era, because that time that Pressler was there, that was really such a golden age with people like George Shibbuck, who Ms. Penny studied with as well, violinist Joseph Gingold, cellist Janos Starker, sopranos Margaret Harshaw and Eileen Farrell, just these incredible luminaries that turned out successful student after successful student. It was really such a great time to be there. So I'm happy to be there now, but I wish I had had a taste of when Mr. Pressler was there. So I unfortunately, he died last year, and unfortunately the last couple years of his life, he was living in London. He had only one student at IU that he was teaching only online, actually. So unfortunately I never got to meet him in person. But the piano was built in 1945, and Mr. Pressler came in 1955 to IU. And to my best knowledge, he had the piano almost from the beginning of his time there. Horowitz practiced on it in 1975 when he came to play at the IU auditorium. So Mr. Pressler famously allowed little to no voicing or regulation or work to be done on the piano, as he thought it was best to challenge his students to rise above the obstacle of drawing a good quality sound from the instrument. So really, as I said, when it arrived in my studio, it was in shockingly rough shape. But I could tell that just the bones of the instrument were something very special. The soundboard is in incredible shape, so resonant. It has this amazing deep bass, but really, really hard to control. Very uneven sound and action, so hopefully all that will soon be worked on. But I did have it voiced a lot this year, and it made a huge difference. And just the inherent tone is, as I said, that tone of an old Steinway, just a long, regal sound that is so satisfying. So I want to first start by something that I think encapsulates Mr. Pressler's love for sound is a great story that I just heard Caroline Hong from Ohio State tell at the IU Piano Academy. She said she was at the American Liszt Society Festival one year, and the colleagues were gathered around, they were telling stories, and they started talking about Beethoven's Fourth Concerto. And one person said, oh, I studied with so-and-so, and I played the opening of and I was going to play through the whole concerto, and we were going to work through it. So I played the opening. Stop. They stopped me after the first line, and we worked on the first line. And then the next person pipes up and says, well, I studied with so-and-so, and I played... Stop! And we continued to work on the first few measures. And then the next person pipes up and says, well, I studied with so-and-so, and I did. Stop! And the final person said, well, I studied with Mr. Pressler, and I did. Stop! But I think it's just encapsulating of how he likely, I don't know firsthand, but likely he was so much about how you make the sound, really, how you draw the sound from the instrument. So I just love that story. So I'm going to read a few responses I got back from wonderful colleagues. Some a bit longer, but just great material and thoughts and memories. So the first is from Winston Choi, who is professor of piano at Roosevelt University in Chicago. And he says, his is one of the longer ones, but just some great tidbits in here. So he says, I studied with Mr. Pressler for 6 years, 1995 to 2001, while earning my bachelor's and master's degrees. During those glorious years, I estimated having around 140 or 150 lessons on the piano that's now in your studio. And some lessons were with the great artists on this email chain that I had reached out to when they were subbing for Mr. Pressler. Mr. Pressler was a demanding teacher with exceedingly high standards, easily offended by indifferent, careless, unprepared, or harsh playing. However, he ignited in me a profound curiosity and passion for learning, as his insatiable appetite for music was infectious. So many lessons were eye-opening and transformative. For instance, Mr. Pressler would insist on the importance of tension and release within music, starting with a two-note slur, a 5-1 cadence, or resolving a phrase beautifully. These ideals were deeply imprinted on me. He could never be indifferent to them, no matter how many times he heard, taught, or played a passage. A surprising modulation or unexpected turn of phrase would elicit a visceral reaction from him, and it almost seemed to torture him when a student was unaffected by these musical miracles. More than once, he described half steps with the quote, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." These and countless other ideals seeped into my playing, opening my eyes and ears in completely new ways. It was like hearing in 3 dimensions for the first time, or seeing and hearing colors I had never realized existed. Mr. Pressler had a way of encouraging students to embrace the score, combing through it repeatedly in search of greater beauty and deeper truths. He found endless inspiration in listening to music, and I enjoyed observing his facial expressions out of the corner of my eye while he listened, even when he was wincing in pain. I was completely motivated to work at an almost feverish pitch, driven by the combination of old-school intimidation and fear, coupled with a great admiration for the artist and post-lesson inspiration. Between lessons, many of us discussed how we struggled with the piano in his studio. Never having practiced on the instrument outside of lessons, I made it my mission to find ways to tame the beast. I remember being in a convoluted physical position, believing I could control a passage better with certain hand angles and sheer willpower, for example in Chopin Opus 25, number 7, perhaps in 1996. I recall Mr. Pressler sitting down and demonstrating, which was rare in those days, with coaxing, loving movements and complete emotional immersion in the sincerity of the musical message. The phrase sounded not only perfectly controlled, but warm and reverberating. He delighted in the sonorities he created, not because of ego or pride, but because he was sincerely and honestly moved by the snippet of music in that moment. I forget his exact words, but to paraphrase, he told me not to fight myself or the piano, not to have a confrontational approach to the instrument, but to become one with the sound, treasuring how this was such a beautiful instrument. Something clicked in me, and I kept referencing this moment in my life. It was so deep, yet so simple, and could encompass a large variety of physical and psychological approaches. Rather than controlling and wrestling with the moment, it was about entering it by selflessly giving oneself up to the inspiration of the moment and chasing the ideal. In my practicing and teaching for almost 30 years since that moment, I've been inspired to spend endless amounts of time basking in sound without getting too stuck in my head and bathing in these musical ideals. On another note, the lumpiness that some of us might have experienced with light running passages due to the uneven action and voicing motivated me to wake up an extra hour earlier or to stay up that extra hour to practice more. The piano certainly played a role in Mr. Pressler's own pianism and musicianship, and it was crucial in my musical upbringing. I have distinct memories of certain registers of the piano having their own idiosyncrasies, and touching the instrument floods me with memories. I had a full circle moment during one of these teaching stints when I filled in for him. My last lessons with Mr. Pressler in the summer of 2001 were on Ravel's Gaspard. I did return to play for him a few times after that, but those were my official last lessons with him as a student. I particularly struggled with Ondine, mostly due to control issues and that piano. The lessons were fantastic, full of inspiration and wisdom, but I also felt deeply unsatisfied with my own playing. He didn't critique me then as harshly as he might have earlier on, partially because these were my final lessons, but also because I think he saw that I had assimilated some of the exacting standards and sensitivity he wanted to impart. The fact that I was deeply bothered by the sounds I was hearing and cared so much without getting in my head about it, perhaps prompted him to give me a positive send-off. And then the next response I have is from Professor Harding, Christopher Harding, who studied with Pressler. Professor Harding says, the memory that stands out most immediately for me is my lesson on Brahms' piano quintet that I had with him, where I misvoiced a melody note that just popped out way too loud, and he yelled in front of everyone, "No, that is bad, why do you do that?" I replied that I didn't mean it, it wasn't my fault. But he said very quickly, "But yes, it was your fault." That was a major lesson. No one had ever told me before what I was doing was bad. I encountered that from him in my first year, month, or maybe even my first lesson of my master's with him. I played Ginastera, first sonata, first movement, and it was pretty good, I think. But after finishing the performance, I looked over and he was just looking at me like I was not particularly valuable. And then he calmly got up, found his copy of the sonata, and showed me that Ginastera had inscribed a lovely note to him on the title page, "To the brilliant pianist, Menahem Pressler." He also told me that what was remarkable about Ginastera was that his music was so violent, but he himself was the most gentle man. And you know what? The first thing that changed with me when I went to study with him was my idea of sound. So you'll see this recurring theme through these responses. He was so much about sound. And if you know Mr. Pressler's recordings with his trio, the sound is just absolutely to die for. It's golden. The first thing that changed with me when I went to study with him was my idea of sound. If someone had asked me in my undergrad to sing something, I would have just sung la la la. But Pressler never played for me in the lessons. Actually, only once did he do that, and it was very painful because it was obvious that he had no other way to get to me. He only sang at me, generally, and the syllables he used were so colorful and beautiful and descriptive of sound, it completely changed my understanding. And I learned perhaps the most from him from turning pages for his trio concerts in Bloomington. I did this for a few years, and that was an experience to hear his balance with the cello, to feel his creative aesthetic live at work. He was just such a beautiful presence, a tough teacher and an admirable musician. He's probably my favorite musician ever, and I treasure all the years I had with him. But funnily enough, I don't think he was such a riot or a joy to study with. It was all in his manner and his presence, and his devotion and his personality. He did tell me that the mark of a great pianist is control. That in a masterclass for the studio where I played Brahms' D minor concerto, first movement, and we were working on the big climax that builds to the incredible recap, he was standing behind me yelling, and crescendo, crescendo, after each chord that builds the incredible crescendo until I got the loudest climax ever in my life on that old beat-up piano in room 405. So not Pressler's piano, but another classroom. And the whole room burst into applause. He almost pushed me off the bench with approbation after that. It might be one of my proudest moments. Then this is from my friend Ingrid Keller, who is a little bit closer to my age, a more recent graduate of Mr. Pressler's, and she now runs a wonderful concert series in Virginia, the Belvedere series. She said, I got to Indiana University in 2003 to start my master's with Pressler. This was also the year we all celebrated his 80th birthday, although you would never have believed he was that old. I had no idea at that point I would spend the next 6 years studying with him through the end of my doctorate. Within a week of arriving, I had an unfortunate hand surgery on my index finger, and of course I was terrified I wouldn't be able to play for my first lessons. I showed up to meet Mr. Pressler, and he took one look at my bandaged finger, and he said, oh, you'll be fine. I've had to perform with broken ribs. Do you know how incredibly painful that is? Of course, I couldn't argue. Pressler taught us all how to push our limits and do things we didn't think were possible. He also had an unbelievable sixth sense. As soon as you walked in the door, he knew you were feeling strong or weak emotionally, and he would teach accordingly. He'd push you when you were strong, and perhaps be a little gentler when you weren't. When I first brought Rachmaninoff second to him, I was on my way out of my doctorate, already living away from Bloomington, working my first job out of school. In the 6 years I had spent with him, not once did he get out of his chair to demonstrate at the piano. He would simply sing, not terribly well, or hum the way the phrase should go. Imagine my shock when he got out of his seat, kicked me off the bench, and played the opening chords of Rachmaninoff second for me. He wanted to demonstrate the giant crescendo being built out of nothing, and I'm not sure he could find the words to do it. I remember watching him play the opening in amazement, and when he played that final cadence, his eyes left the piano and he looked up at me, and I'll never forget the way his eyes looked, a searing fire behind them. He had embodied that music to its core, and it was all he needed to do to demonstrate to me the power of that famous introduction. And then my friend Jerry Wong, who taught many years at Kent State, and now he's at a university in Australia. I imagine you have plenty of material by now, but I would just add one reflection from my first couple of months of study under Mr. Pressler. He had asked me to work through all of Schumann's Fantasy-Stücke, Opus 12, which was a work he gave very often to new undergraduates. We were on the very first piece and discussing the concepts you might expect, pedal, balance, and expressing the cross rhythms. But I would note that even though he had probably already taught the piece to dozens of other students, he introduced all these concepts to me with the most loving tone in his voice. It was as if he was experiencing everything in a new and fresh manner all over again. He was still mesmerized and transfixed by the beauty of the music. Eventually, he did something that was very rare and asked me to stand up so that he could demonstrate his Abends on that very piano. In fact, I don't know that I ever saw him do this again over the course of the next 4 years. Also an underlying theme. Apparently, he just never demonstrated in lessons. He was often noted to have said during interviews that he didn't like to demonstrate for students due to a fear that they might become a mimic of his very unique and personal style. In any case, what I remember the most was his velvety and caressing touch. He kept his fingers very close to the keys and maintained the most exquisite legato. The close of his work, the close of the work was really special, and I remember him murmuring, "You need to kind of taste the interesting harmonies as you play this." I was a very naive 18-year-old at the time, but the demonstration left me transfixed. It remains vivid in my mind all these many years later. And then we have Professor Chow. I think he was also speaking on behalf of Professor Cheng. He says, "We spent 7 years with Mr. Pressler, and it was a miraculous time working with him. He was in his late 50s, early 60s at the time, and he always referred to himself as the Energizer Bunny. He was simply indefatigable, often flying in on red eyes, going directly to school to begin his teaching at 8 a.m., and often not finishing until after dinner. With such long days of teaching, you'd think he might conserve his energy for himself, but he never gave anything less than 100% for who was sitting right in front of him. After his day of teaching, he would return home, take a short nap, and then get up to practice again until well after midnight. This was his daily routine. He lived and breathed to express himself in musical terms. He never expected anything less from us, his students. He often showed impatience, sometimes anger, even disappointment, but it was never personal. It was because we weren't giving the music the respect it deserved. He taught us to respect the intentions of the composer, to search for the beauty in the music, to feel the music in our core. One of his favorite expressions was, "Don't play like you have a callus on your heart." No matter how often we might repeat a passage or play a piece over many months and years, we should never become callous to the emotional content. Because of Mr. Pressler, we came to have greater and deeper understanding of the music we played and taught, and the joy that results from it has been immeasurable. One personal story, I had gotten a job, this is Mr. Chow, Professor Chow. I had gotten a job in Arkansas, I think that was maybe his first job, to begin in August of 1987, and Angela and I had decided we would get married in October of 1987, and we made plans to move to Arkansas together. When we told Mr. Pressler our plans, he was so happy that we were to be married, he often credited himself with bringing us together. But he said that Angela was not ready to leave his tutelage, and so he told me to go on by myself and that Angela could join me a year later. Being dutiful students, we did exactly as he said, and we spent the first year of our married life in 2 different states. It didn't even come to our minds to do anything other than what he said. I do remember that my phone bills were often higher than our rent payments. And just 2 more. My former teacher from high school, who was his assistant in the 70s, Robert Myer, says this: "I'm probably the oldest person on this list, Spencer, and I also had the honor to give several lessons to some of the people on this list when I was subbing for Mr. Pressler. I clearly remember my earliest interaction. My teacher in Montreal had another student, Frances Gray, who had started her master's the previous year, and my teacher suggested that I do the same. I arrived on March 6, 1970. It was a Saturday, immediately after my 1 p.m. audition, after starting at 9 a.m. in Montreal. I found MP's studio. We often called him Mezzo Piano, or occasionally Mighty Mouse. I knocked, no appointment, no warning, no previous contact. To my immense gratitude, after I introduced myself and invoked Francis's name, he invited me in, saying that he had exactly 10 minutes. In that time, I played the beginning of Ravel's Undine and perhaps some Schumann G minor sonata. I was unable to do much to control the opening of Undine at the beginning and felt that I was demonstrating a rather raw voice and little physical command. He suggested that I make more of the voicing rather than worrying unduly about the specific dynamic level. Of course, that was liberating because trying to do it right was much harder than trying to do it persuasively. He accepted me on the spot, and I didn't realize for a long time exactly how lucky I had been and how remarkably ignorant I had been about the application process. IU was my school of choice, he was my teacher of choice, and that was that. Through some more good fortune, he made room for me in a summer session. In June, I told him that I had 2 important performances at the end of the summer, a short recital and Rhapsody in Blue, which was a new piece for me, a performance with the Montreal Symphony. In those days, he put every student on an exercise regimen, and he was not particularly happy that I had things to play soon. He told me that we two would only work exercises for 6.5 weeks, and that I would play my repertoire at the end of the summer. He didn't want my new technique built from the ground up to interfere with the old technique that I had to rely on for my repertoire. In any event, the summer provided amazing discoveries. On his piano, I worked the subtlest of gestures, 5-finger exercises using what I now call fingertip articulation with no arm weight, and the largest of gestures, like Hammond with 1 drop per note, or up to 8 notes with 1 gesture and no finger articulation. Of course, the fact that the piano was imperfect made the need to adjust to try to find the evenness that much more revealing. I spent many hours in practice rooms exploring the subtle nuances of each gesture and what I had discovered. He seemed delighted that I had found analyses and words to help represent his concepts of sonority and gesture. So he started to assign my fellow students to me and make practice and executional suggestions. To this day, I recognize that his recognition of my particular gift of talking, of the gab, and of analysis turned me into the teacher and the lover of teaching that I became. And then the last, almost the most all-encompassing response is from Miss Pennies herself. She studied mostly with Mr. Shebach, but when Mr. Shebach went on sabbatical, she studied with Mr. Pressler for a short time. She said, the big thing I got from Pressler was his light, the incredible joy that oozed from him every time I got near the piano. I am an early riser, and I often found myself arriving at the music building about the same time as him. I would watch him park and bounce into the building, and as he got closer to the studio, he would hum or whistle. In a matter of seconds after the door closed, the love of music would just pour out of his studio. It was such an honor to receive his energy day after day. This gift of his that he gave to everyone so openly and freely is the essence of life. There are not so many who shine so brightly, and I believe that it is his light that opens imagination and a future for all. So that's a little tidbit about Mr. Pressler and the piano. I do practice occasionally on the piano, but generally I leave it for the students and I practice on the second piano. But every time I touch that piano, it's really just such a special window into history. It's just such an incredible, as I said, it's incredible intrinsic sound and just really a joy to play. And some of my most fun repertoire I've practiced on that has been Debussy, because it's all about sound and colors. So I'm going to play some Debussy for you now. I've chosen 9 of the preludes, 4 from book 1 and 5 from book 2. So I'm going to start with Voile, which I'm sure many of you know the preludes, but I'll give you the translations. Voile in French can either mean sails or veils. So you use your imagination and decide. And then I'll play Le Vent à la Plaine, which is the wind on the plain. And then, let's see, I'm going out of order, so I'm doing the Des Pas sur la Neige, footprints in the snow, or footsteps in the snow, which might be my favorite of the 24 preludes. It's just a miraculous piece. And then the 2 Spanish-influenced pieces, first the Interrupted Serenade, and then La Puerta del Vino. And then the fairies are exquisite dancers, Les Fées sont d'exquises danseuses, which is actually based on one of the original illustrations for Peter Pan of the fairies. And then after the fairies, I'll play the Terrace of Moonlight Audiences, or Audiences of the Moonlight. And then Ondine, I think we all know Ondine is the beautiful and dangerous water nymph. And then finally, Feu d'artifice, or fireworks. So 9 Debussy preludes. Thank you.